If I start with Unpsychology, so Unpsychology magazine I'd say it's a growing publication. We've been going since 2014. The first issue came out. I'm just going to find it. The first issue came out in 2014, and that's the paper version of it. We don't produce paper versions anymore, partly because it just costs too much, and distribution and all of the things. For if any of you are involved in indie publishing, you'll know kind of the challenges of that. So after we published the first three, we decided to go online with it, and it's a very hand-to-mouth magazine. There's literally myself and one co-editor, and then we ask and rely on really writers and artists and poets and a whole range of other people and therapists and people to contribute their work, to contribute their time, and we do the same. So it's a kind of a gift economy magazine. It's not a literary magazine which is looking to kind of pay people by the word or anything like that. We have a space which is kind of values led, I think, and it's not just about writing. It's about a whole range of things. The way it came out was that going back to about 10 years now, maybe a little bit longer actually, to 12 years, I think, there was a project called the Dark Mountain Project, which came out, and it was two guys in the UK, Dougal Hine and Paul Kingsnorth. And Paul is a writer. He's I think he was longlisted for the Booker Prize a couple of years ago. And Dougal is an activist and teacher, and he lives in Sweden now. But they kind of got together in a pub in Oxford one day and started to talk about climate change and the environmental movement as it was then probably in the UK, but also globally. And what they kind of decided was that a lot of the narratives around climate and environmentalism were kind of too positive, is one way of putting it, as opposed to too optimistic on one level. At that time there was a sort of a way of thinking about climate, which was that we can turn this around, we can do this. And they decided that they didn't feel that was possible. Now, that's still an open question. Some people are still on the optimistic side and some people aren't. But what they then decided to do is that the task wasn't just about turning around climate change at a global level in the way that say COP26 has just been struggling with in Glasgow, but actually they were saying, well, what we really need are people like artists and writers to be responding to this and kind of creating cultural frameworks for new thinking, new ways of being in a kind of a post-climate world. So we're talking about, 2009 was the first gathering of I think 2010, sorry, was the first gathering of the Dark Mountain Project. And it was very much based on what writers and artists and poets and various other people could do. So the Dark Mountain Project was something, and they had these gatherings called Uncivilization. So the gatherings were called just Uncivilization gatherings, and they were kind of mini festivals of people who came together in the UK. Who came together to talk about these issues, but also to share music, to share art, to share poetry. They were really good events, and I went to. There was 4 of them in the early part of that decade, and I went to 3 of them. And at the end of that time, they decided to pull the festivals for some reason. But at the end of the time, I'd got involved a little bit more, and I was exploring some of the psychological aspects of that. My background is I'm a psychotherapist, mainly working in education, schools and colleges and universities over the last 2 decades. but also with some private practice as well. And so the idea that the existential challenge of climate and sixth extinction and what they called peak oil at that time, that those crises had a major psychological impact on people wherever they were, as well as practical impacts on people. And so I set up this kind of sub-project called Unpsychology, and the first Unpsychology workshop took place at one of the Dark Mountain events, and it gathered about 60 or 70 people on this Sunday morning workshop. It was quite amazing. It was a bit like, thinking 3 people would turn up, and actually we had this gathering and it was an outside event underneath these trees in this forest, and somebody had hung a parachute, and it was a sunny morning. So it was one of those magical kind of mornings that we all kind of come across now and again. And we had this conversation about unpsychology and what that would look like. And so, broadly speaking, what to me it looked like, and what it looked like to. Sorry. Yeah. So what unpsychology looked like to me was this sort of, what would it be like if we sort of integrated but then inverted the kind of assumptions that psychology has. And I mean, as a psychotherapist, often my profession is too tied up with diagnoses and too tied up with labels and too tied up with one-dimensional projects of getting better and healing, rather than seeing the person in the round. So, in a sense, the person is at the heart of their psychology, and the psychology is embedded within the world. And so that kind of philosophy and psychology was the kind of thing that I was interested in exploring. And so those people who've been involved in the project, some of them psychotherapists, some of them people who actually had mental health issues themselves, some of them who were just interested in these issues in the broader sense, started to kind of put the magazines together. And what's happened over that period of time is that we've got up to, I think we've done 7 magazines since then. So we were up to number 8, which is the forthcoming one, which I'll mention in a moment, but up to 7. And all of them kind of have an ecological feel. All of them have a systemic feel. All of them kind of have the work woven together. And it's kind of, to me, that my favorite task of the year, because we publish about 1 a year, is this sort of curation of this material that comes in, this kind of quite diverse material, sometimes quite unexpected material often, and finding a way of pulling it together, knitting it together, melding it together in a way which actually makes some sense, but also not just makes sense, but kind of has a sense, when you pick the magazine up or you see it on the screen, that has some sort of cohesion and head somewhere, not necessarily a direction, but kind of a bit like heading into the woods for an adventure, that kind of heading into somewhere, rather than heading towards somewhere. It's heading into somewhere which has some depth to it, has some darkness in it, has some dappling light coming through the parachute, as I mentioned earlier on. So, it was almost like a recreation of that session. And each issue kind of comes out a little bit like that. We've done, in the time that we've done it, we decided after the first 2 issues to kind of make each issue based on a theme. So each issue now has a specific theme. So the first of those was one called Childhood. So that one is the Childhood edition. And that's the one, in some ways, it's the one that made me wish we were still doing paper versions, because actually it's a very beautiful object. It's beautifully designed. Actually, my daughter designed that one, and she sort of set the template for all subsequent magazines in some way. So we use a similar sort of framework for those. And yeah, again, so we did that one on childhood, and then we did one. We did the next one on climate. and then we did one on music, which included a playlist of music online, which went alongside the writing and the poetry and all of that sort of stuff. And then we did one on the other than human, which was one of my favorites because it was just so damn beautiful. There was just such amazing it was like sort of, there was some sacred stuff in it. It was like people really kind of getting into the other than human world and saying, this is where I am. This is where I am. And some of it was kind of people. There was a beautiful couple of pieces about childhood experiences with animals or with other than human. There was an amazing piece of art which kind of lots of amazing pieces of art which kind of really just went in very, very strange directions. And you'd have to look at the magazine to really get a picture of it. But that to me was a really real high point. And then I was getting, as some of you have started to talk about, I was getting a little bit into Nora Bateson's work, and I'll come back to Nora in a moment. But at that time, it felt like what Nora was saying and and I'd come across Gregory Bateson, her father, a few years before, and had engaged, but hadn't really embedded as much as Nora's work did. And when I kind of read Nora's work and then came across her and then met her and was able to have some conversations with her, it was one of those moments when I was thinking, that's what that was about. That's what that's about. It kind of gave a language to what felt to be intrinsic, implicit for me. And so that's why we went to the last edition, which was on climate complexity and change. We wanted to kind of acknowledge the complexity aspect of the climate crisis. So we went back to the climate crisis and kind of looked at it in a sort of more contemporary basis, 2 or 3 or 4 years after the first one. And again, that was a very rich issue, and it is a very rich issue, and that was last year's one. And so when I was talking to Julia, who's my co-editor, we were thinking about, well, where do we need to go right now with this? And it felt that we wanted to kind of stick with a kind of an issues-based process, but at the same time, we didn't just want it to be, issue after issue. You can easily do that. You could go into a whole range of issues-based stuff. We kind of wanted to ask the question, well, what might be needed on a broader basis? So if we think of all these things which are out there, what might be needed to underpin that? I'd had some connections with what's called the psychology community, which is a very broad church and has some real wisdoms in it, but it takes things into at some stages it can take us into quite a magical thinking place, which is fine. I've got no problems with magical thinking, except that I go through phases where I have phases where I am more magical and more perhaps open to kind of spiritual positions, and then I kind of flip back, or I move back to a much more materialist position, and a kind of a let's see where the science takes us, and that sort of position. And I know that's part of my own process, so it's not. I know that there's truth in both, but I find myself back, and probably this is to do with COVID and some of the kind of experiences and I've had during the lockdowns. But I find myself much back in a place where I was thinking, yeah, we need to be able to say something concrete here about what might be needed, which then takes me into the warm data process, which actually is not concrete at all, but it is a process which addresses the complexity of the issues that we're talking about.